Hey guys, tonight we travel into the blistering heart of the ancient Persian desert. The sun has just dipped below the horizon, but the heat still pulses from the stone walls around you. Sand crunches under your feet, the wind carries that faint metallic scent of dust, and ahead, just barely visible through the rising dusk, is a strange, hulking dome. It looks like a spaceship crashed here a few thousand years early. But no, this isn't science fiction. It's real. It's ancient. And it's freezing? You step closer, hand reaching out toward the structure. The mud brick is rough and cool. Too cool. And behind it, the air shifts, like breathing near an open freezer. This is no mirage. You found something extraordinary, a Yakchal, one of the oldest refrigerators on Earth. You're about to walk into the middle of an empire where people not only kept water from boiling away in the desert heat, but turned it into ice cream. And let's be clear, this was a time when the average traveler could die of heat stroke just crossing a courtyard. So the idea of slurping rose-flavored sorbet under the scorching sun? Yeah, you probably wouldn't survive this. Not without a little ancient Persian engineering magic. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, let me know your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking now, carefully around the base of this Yakchal, literally ice pit in Persian. It rises like a giant beehive, thick-walled and silent. You peer upward. There's no roof in the way you expect. Instead, there's a tiny hole up top, just wide enough to make you wonder what might crawl out in the dark. Inside, the air is startling. Chilly. Dry. Not just cooler than the outside air, it's cold. You glance around. No wires. No switches. No humming compressors. And yet, somewhere deeper inside, buried under the earth and centuries of dust, lies something colder still, slabs of ice. Ice that's been sitting here through blazing summers, insulated in silence. Your fingers trail along the wall. It's made of sarouj, a material with ingredients like clay, egg whites, lime, and sand, basically the ancient Persian version of industrial insulation foam. And it works. Sarouj repels heat and water like a champ. Historians still argue whether the Persians discovered it by trial and error or inherited it from even older desert tribes. Either way, you can feel its effect immediately. The outer world fades. In here, time slows. At the far end of the chamber, there's a slope downward. You descend, the air growing colder. You're now below ground level. It's quiet here, eerily so. If someone drops a pin outside, you won't hear it. Just your own breath and the occasional creak of cooling earth. This was the heart of the ice house. The pit where ice was stored after being harvested during frigid desert nights. Not just ice for cooling drinks, mind you. This was ice meant for dessert. Sweet, fragrant faluda or creamy, sticky bastani. And to create these frozen delights, the Persians didn't just rely on one trick. Oh no, they had a whole system. You exit the chamber and walk around the Yakchal's exterior. There's a low wall nearby, barely waist high. It encloses a shallow depression. You hop down into it and crouch. This, friend, is where the magic began. On winter nights, shallow pools of water were poured into this stone basin. The desert has a funny quality, despite scorching days, the nights drop drastically in temperature. Sometimes even below freezing. Especially in the arid Iranian plateau. The pools were arranged wide and flat to maximize surface area. At night, under a star-heavy sky, the heat would radiate out of the water so quickly that it'd freeze into a thin sheet of ice by morning. But here's the kicker, even when the air wasn't quite freezing, the setup still worked. Why? Because the desert's dry, clear air let radiation escape fast enough for water to freeze. It's a neat physics loophole. Scientists today call it radiative cooling. You don't need below zero air temperatures, just the right conditions for heat to flee the scene. You lift a slab of imaginary ice from the basin, just as ancient workers would have done at dawn. They cut the sheets with care, no power tools, just smooth blades and calloused hands, and stacked them into the yachtule before the sun could melt their harvest. Straw or ash would be layered between each ice chunk to stop them from fusing or melting prematurely. Oddly enough, straw is an amazing insulator. Not high-tech, but high-function. By the time summer rolled around, these people could walk into the ice house, retrieve a few perfect cubes, and stroll out like chilled-out desert royalty. Now, let's zoom out. Imagine living here thousands of years ago. There's no fridge humming in the background. No corner store to grab a popsicle. Just fire, wind, and sun. And yet, you have ice. You make ice cream. You host a feast with cold drinks while other cities boil in misery. You begin to realize, this isn't just about food. It's about power. Whoever controls the cold, controls comfort. Controls status. Controls summer. And the yachtule? It becomes more than architecture. It becomes a statement. Every visitor who steps inside, every sweating soldier who stumbles across one in the desert, each person walks away amazed. Persians could harness nature itself. They could bend the desert to their will. Some archaeologists think there were once hundreds of these structures across the Persian Empire. Others argue that only the elite cities had the resources and manpower to build and maintain them. The truth? Still up for debate. Historians continue to argue whether they were widespread civic projects or exclusive status symbols hoarded by nobles. But as you run your fingers one last time along the curved wall, you don't care much for scholarly debates. You're just glad someone figured out how to make ice cream in the desert. You step away from the yachtule, blinking under the soft twilight as the temperature outside claws at your skin again. The sudden change reminds you just how impressive that cold silence was. But now you're curious, where did the idea come from? Who was the first genius to think, hey, what if we made ice in the desert? To answer that, you need to walk further back, thousands of years, across windswept plains and camel caravan trails, to the heart of the Achaemenid Empire. You've probably heard of them: Cyrus the Great, Darius, Xerxes. The guys who were so good at empire building that even Alexander the Great had to break a sweat taking them down. But while the world remembers their wars and palaces, it often forgets the finer things, like dessert. Yes, even in the 5th century BCE, the Persians weren't just crushing armies. They were crushing fruit and snow to make early sorbets. This wasn't some back alley luxury either, ice was a state-sponsored pursuit. You're standing now in the ruins of an Achaemenid summer retreat. The walls are gone, but you can imagine the breezes, the rustle of silk robes, and servants passing trays of what the Persians called sharbat, sweetened drinks cooled with mountain snow. And here's the kicker, they didn't wait for winter storms to roll in. They imported snow year-round. That's right. Before they had yachtules, Persian engineers relied on sheer muscle and logistical brilliance. Men on horseback would haul snow from high-altitude peaks, like the Elburz Mountains, and race it down to the cities. Pack it in sawdust, wrap it in layers of wool and leather, and ride like the wind. You thought your job was stressful? Imagine being the guy responsible for keeping the royal dessert cold. But it worked. Somehow, some way, frozen snowballs arrived at court intact. A miracle? Nah, just science, stubbornness, and a splash of fear-based motivation. And it wasn't just for the royal sweet tooth. Cold storage was crucial for medicine, wine, even religious ceremonies. Ice meant preservation. Preservation meant power. It's no surprise then that Persians went from hauling snow to figuring out how to make it locally. More control. Less spoilage. Fewer angry kings when their Faluda arrived as soup. There's a fringe theory among some modern historians, definitely not mainstream, but fun to imagine, that a few Persian engineers might have borrowed ideas from even older civilizations. Like the Egyptians, who stored snow brought down from the mountains of Lebanon. Or maybe they traded ideas with Bactrian inventors, way off to the northeast, where winters were savage and storage pits were lined with rabbit fur. Sounds ridiculous until you realize how far Persian trade routes stretched. And here's where the scholarly debates get spicy. Some researchers argue that Persia invented large-scale cold storage entirely on its own, refining it through generations. Others insist the idea came west from China along early Silk routes. Still others believe the technology evolved independently in multiple places, because when your figs are melting and your wine's lukewarm, innovation becomes a survival instinct. But let's be honest, when it comes to doing it with style, Persia was in a league of its own. These weren't cavemen tossing snow in a hole. They were making snow delicate, elegant. A dessert ritual with gold-trimmed bowls and hints of saffron. You can almost hear the clink of copper spoons. Imagine reclining under a lattice canopy, the air perfumed with rosewater, and a servant offering a chilled bowl of faluda, vermicelli noodles soaked in syrup and crowned with crushed ice. It cools your lips, bites your tongue, and melts down your throat like silk. Not bad for 500 BCE. This was Persia's way, combined science, empire, and aesthetics. And somewhere between those snowy couriers and the first hand-sculpted Yakchal domes, a civilization turned necessity into a kind of quiet luxury. They weren't just surviving the desert, they were chilling in it. Even now, archaeologists discover remnants of insulated chambers and snow storage pits far from the main cities. Clues hint at a broader cold storage network than once believed. Were these regional hubs of frozen trade? Summer resorts for elite families? Historians still argue over the scope. Some believe entire supply chains existed, spanning deserts with ice relays like frozen pony express stations. You take one last look around the ruins before the moon crests over the ridge. The night feels colder now. Or maybe it's just your imagination catching up to the past. You're walking again, this time not through ruins, but along the invisible timeline of human ambition. Somewhere along this path, you start to see the shape of a genius idea forming in the minds of ancient Persian engineers. What if, instead of hauling snow in, we just made it happen here? That's when things get clever. Like, really clever. Picture yourself now in a quiet corner of a Persian village at the edge of the desert. The air is crisp, the stars are like needles in the black sky, and you're standing in front of a flat, open courtyard surrounded by low mud brick walls. Nothing seems high-tech at first. Just sand, silence, and moonlight. But this is where it all happens. This is the ice factory. They called it an ice field, or in Persian, a Yakchal field. By day, it looked like a simple courtyard. But by night, it became a natural refrigerator. The Persians used evaporative cooling, the same principle that makes your skin chill when you sweat. They channeled water into shallow, wide pools at night during winter. The desert's extreme temperature drop did the heavy lifting. Slowly, quietly, the water would freeze into sheets of ice, layer by layer. You crouch beside the ghost of one of these frozen pools, running your fingers along the cracked ground. The low walls around you weren't for decoration, they were insulation, and they blocked the wind. Sometimes the pools were even painted white with lime plaster to reflect the sun and reduce heat absorption during the day. But here's the beauty, the Persians didn't stop at just freezing water, they went full systems engineer. Once the top layer of ice froze overnight, workers would crack it, stack it, and carry it into underground storage beneath a dome. It was a dance repeated night after night, winter after winter. This was the moment where climate wasn't a curse, it was a partner. In fact, the arid Persian night made it possible. You'd think desert equals heat, right? But deserts are sneaky. They drop to freezing at night, sometimes below zero. That rapid cooling, combined with dry air, made the Persian plateau the perfect stage for freezing water with zero electricity, zero machinery, and zero patience for melted dessert. And remember those mud brick domes you saw earlier, the Yakchals? They were more than storage. They were part of the entire process. Some even had wind catchers, or badgers, rising like stone sails to pull in cooler air and vent warm air out. These wind catchers created airflows that kept the internal temperature of a Yakchal stable, hovering just above freezing, even when outside temps soared to 100 degrees Fahrenheit or more. You wander along one of the ancient irrigation channels, still faintly visible in the dirt. These qanats, sloped underground aqueducts, were essential. They brought in water not just for drinking and crops, but for ice making too. And since they ran below ground, the water inside them stayed cool before arriving at the freezing fields. There's even some archaeological evidence that Persians understood something close to insulation science. Straw, clay, mud brick, even ash layers, materials that seemed primitive were engineered with intent. Stack them correctly, and they trapped cool air while deflecting solar heat. You reach down and brush away some dust from the wall of a yachtl. The plaster's long gone, but you can still see where it once gleamed. A fine mix of clay, lime, egg whites, yes, egg whites, and sometimes goat hair. Historians still argue whether this recipe was for insulation, strength, or both. Some fringe researchers even claim the mixture had antibacterial properties. Sounds wild, but who are we to judge? These people made ice cream in the desert 2,400 years ago. And they didn't stop at 1 or 2 facilities. Evidence of yachtls has been found across Iran, in Yazd, Kerman, Kashan, and even desert outposts where you'd assume refrigeration dreams went to die. Each one adapted to local conditions, slightly different angles, materials, wall heights. Like ancient versions of climate-adaptive architecture. One particularly strange detail you notice in the ruins, the base of some yachtls are slightly concave. Not flat, concave. Was it to collect condensation? To funnel meltwater into reuse? Or maybe it was just easier to build that way. No one's quite sure. And honestly, that's part of the fun. Tonight, your feet crunch softly along a forgotten path between 2 of these ancient domes. In the moonlight, they look like sleeping elephants, massive, gentle, quietly magical. You think about the hands that built them. Generations of artisans, engineers, farmers, and cooks, all bound together by the humble dream of cold. Cold in a place that tried every day to erase it. The very process of freezing in these fields took patience, precision, and ritual. Workers had to monitor the pools constantly, timing, temperatures, cracks in the ice. They knew the desert sky like a watch face and could read frost patterns like lines of poetry. And the payoff? That first crackle of ice, lifted from the pool, wrapped in sawdust and straw, lowered deep into the belly of the earth. Stored there until the sun was blistering and the people needed relief. There's an old Persian folk saying, roughly translated, what warms you in winter, cools you in summer. Sounds backwards, doesn't it? But they're talking about the earth, the same deep earth that protects water from heat, that shelters seeds, and that keeps ice frozen when the air above is burning. You sit quietly now, in the shadow of genius and patience, feeling a chill that doesn't belong to this century. The sunlight now bleaches the edges of everything around you. Shadows shrink, the sand glows like powdered gold, and even the air feels like it's humming from the heat. You wipe your brow, but the memory of that yachtl chill still clings to your bones like a ghost that refuses to leave. Good thing, too, because now we go deeper. You wander past the crumbling outlines of an old Persian village, where architecture and engineering blended into a lifestyle built around water. See that sun-baked wall? Follow it, and you find a gentle slope leading to a strange dark hole in the earth. It's not a cellar. It's a qanat shaft, part of the sprawling underground aqueduct system that powered the entire ecosystem of ancient Persia, including your favorite frozen treats. The qanat is a marvel, honestly. Imagine digging a tunnel, angled just right, so water from distant mountain snowmelt can flow downhill, under the desert, to reach your village. Now imagine doing that 2,500 years ago, without dynamite, power tools, or Google Earth. You just had picks, donkeys, and centuries of wisdom passed down through blistered hands. As you kneel by the shaft, cool air brushes your face. That's not your imagination. The qanats doubled as climate regulators. The airflow in these tunnels often moved up toward the surface, bringing a kiss of chill to desert towns. And just like that, the missing puzzle piece appears. The qanats didn't just bring water. They brought cold. Now step inside, yes, carefully. You grip the narrow ledge and lower yourself into the cool earth. The transition is instant. The heat above vanishes. Inside the Kanat tunnel, it's a different world, narrow, humid, alive with echoes of dripping water and unseen flows. You move carefully, hunched but awestruck. These tunnels were dug with mathematical precision. A half-degree too steep? The water flows too fast and erodes the walls. Too flat? It stagnates and breeds bacteria. The Persian engineers mastered this balance millennia ago. Some Kanats ran for tens of kilometers. Entire cities, like ancient Gonabad, were built on top of them, and their water still flows today. You follow the tunnel with your hand brushing the side, the wall cold to the touch. It's no wonder these became part of the cooling process. Kanats fed the ice fields. They regulated the temperature of storage domes. And in some rare cases, they were directly connected to ice houses, keeping the chambers moist and chilly. One obscure theory, don't quote us too seriously, says that some yachtals were positioned directly above Kanat outflows to siphon off cool drafts, nature's air conditioner. Historians still argue whether that's architectural poetry or just wishful modern thinking, but you have to admit, it sounds brilliant enough to be true. Now pause a moment and consider this: the entire Persian desert was essentially rigged with a passive refrigeration grid, using nothing but gravity, airflow, mud brick, and pure tenacity. The kind of innovation that would make a Silicon Valley startup founder cry into his compostable coffee cup. And while the technology itself was incredible, the real genius was how it scaled. Small villages had mini-systems. Larger cities had sprawling Kanat networks. There was no one-size-fits-all design. Instead, locals tuned each element, depth, dome size, insulation, orientation, to match their specific geography. One town might rely more on wind catchers, another on deeper Kanats, another on longer freeze pools. You reach a bend in the tunnel where the sound of moving water grows louder. You crouch and listen. It's hypnotic. This isn't just plumbing. It's a lifeline, and in many ways, a cultural backbone. Children were taught to respect the Kanats. Maintenance crews, called mokanis, passed their roles down through generations like sacred priesthoods. Their work wasn't glamorous, but it kept entire regions alive. And let's not forget the darker edges. Kanats were strategic resources. Controlling one could shift power in a region. Sabotaging one was an act of war. And repairing one? That could earn you the eternal gratitude of an entire town. You finally reach a chamber where the ceiling rises slightly and the air smells faintly of clay and minerals. This was a maintenance alcove, used by workers to rest and sometimes store tools. The tools are gone now, of course, but the marks remain. Etchings in the stone. Maybe names. Maybe prayers. You lean back and think, how many people sat right here, soaked in sweat, covered in dust, holding a lantern and hoping the next tunnel wouldn't collapse on them? And all of it, for cold water. For ice. And there's one final, slightly wild theory floating in the academic ether, that certain ceremonial events involving royalty included a symbolic journey through these Kanats. A cooling rite of passage, if you will. Some claim a king-to-be would descend into a Kanat to experience the chill of the underworld before re-emerging under the open sky, reborn and refreshed. Sound dramatic? Yeah. Sound plausible in an empire obsessed with balance, temperature, and symbolism? Definitely. You begin your slow ascent back to the surface, blinking against the harsh sunlight. The air feels heavier now. Hotter. Like it's reminding you just how rare that subterranean chill was. And yet, somehow, the memory of it lingers. The genius of ancient Persia wasn't just that they made ice in the desert. It's that they made it last. The sun hangs over the desert like a slow roasting lamp, and yet you're surprisingly comfortable. Not because the heat has eased, but because you now carry an invisible shield, the knowledge of how Persians tamed this climate. And just when you think you've seen every trick in their icy playbook, the landscape offers you another oddity rising from the earth like a mirage made of mud brick. You squint at a towering chimney-like structure jutting above an old building. It's tall, hollow, and capped with slotted openings facing different directions. It looks like a chimney that forgot what smoke was. But this, my friend, is a wind catcher, or badger, and it might be the coolest structure in the entire Persian desert, literally and figuratively. Wind catchers were architectural lungs, designed to inhale the faintest breeze, amplify it, cool it, and funnel it downward into homes, storage rooms, and, yes, yachtals. They were, essentially, giant evaporative air conditioners from 1,000 years before anyone in the West thought to plug a fan into a wall. You step under the shade of one now, and the temperature difference is immediate. A soft gust sweeps over your face. It's like walking past the open door of a supermarket freezer. Somehow, in the middle of nowhere, this tower has summoned cold wind from thin air. You look up through the slotted opening and see sky, and realize just how high it stretches. No fans. No moving parts. Just gravity, clever engineering, an airflow design that would make a physicist weep with joy. But wind catchers weren't just stick it on the roof and forget it kind of tools. Oh no. Their design was deeply customizable. Engineers oriented each face of the badger based on local wind patterns, pressure zones, and sun exposure. Some were single vent. Others had up to 8 faces, an octagonal air whisperer, if you will. And these weren't just passive coolers. Some wind catchers worked in tandem with underground water channels, drawing cooler air up through the canat and sending it spiraling into homes. It was like combining a mountain breeze with a cellar chill and piping it right into your bedroom. You step inside a nearby room, once part of a merchant summer home, and immediately feel it. The wind catcher above you isn't even functioning fully anymore, centuries of wear have clogged its inner passageways, but even so, the room is 10 degrees cooler than outside. The air drifts lazily around your ankles. You lean back against the wall and just exhale. Some scholars believe badgers inspired similar cooling towers in North Africa and parts of the Islamic world. Others argue whether Egypt or Persia got there first, because, of course, historians still debate that. But regardless of origin, Persia made it aesthetically sublime. These weren't just practical structures. They were art. Symmetrical. Glazed. Sometimes painted. Even humming a low tune when the wind hit just right. And here's where it gets quirky. One fringe theory suggests badgers were once used as musical instruments. No, seriously. Some think that specific tower designs created tonal harmonics, accidental flutes built into homes. There's even debate about whether high-ranking officials intentionally tuned their wind catchers to produce calming or ceremonial frequencies. Is that a stretch? Maybe. But when you're living in a desert kingdom where airflow equals survival, you're allowed a little poetry in your ductwork. As you explore the next room, you notice the stone basin at its center. Not for drinking, this was a cooling pool, shallow and tiled, positioned directly beneath the badger. Air would flow down the shaft, across the water, and circulate throughout the room even cooler than before. Basically, ancient Persians invented a water-cooled air purifier. You half expect to see a Dyson logo carved into the wall. Wind catchers didn't just cool rooms, they created microclimates. Some elite homes had entire wings constructed specifically for summer use, with wind catchers, thick mud brick walls, and curved ceilings that diffused heat upward. You can practically hear the sighs of ancient nobles, lounging on cushions, sipping rosewater sorbet, marveling at how they turned the desert into a gentle breeze. And while we're talking elite, let's not forget the cold chambers, special rooms carved into estates and temples where ice and sweet treats were stored specifically for guests of high status. Some historians believe these chambers were reserved only for visiting emissaries or celebrations tied to lunar festivals. Kind of like today's VIP backstage access, except, made of mud and full of noodles suspended in snow syrup. You duck into one such chamber, its entry now partially crumbled but still walkable. Inside, the temperature holds steady, just like the yachtal. The wind catcher's shaft runs above you. You glance up and imagine it once whispered chilled air directly onto a bowl of saffron-drenched Faluda. Oh, and here's a practical mystery scholars love to debate. How did they clean these wind catchers? Some had maintenance ladders built in. Others used special pulley systems. There are even paintings showing children hoisted up in baskets to dust the louvers. Adorable, and slightly terrifying. You step back outside, feeling the hot air hit again. It's jarring, like someone cranked the oven back on. But your understanding has shifted. The Persian genius wasn't in their inventions alone. It was how they combined them: ice houses, qanats, wind catchers, evaporation pools, all working in harmony to create a sustainable cold chain in an unforgiving land. You look up one last time at the towering badger. It doesn't move. It doesn't hum. But somehow, it still breathes. You pull your scarf a little tighter now, not because it's cold, far from it, but because you're about to follow the thread from public architecture to private indulgence. Let's be honest, if your mind isn't already lingering on the thought of actual ancient Persian ice cream by now, it's only because you haven't tasted it yet. So let's walk away from the wind catchers, leave behind the grand domes and buried aqueducts, and instead step into the inner courtyard of a wealthy Persian home. Not a palace, mind you, but certainly not your average goat-herder's hut either. The kind of place where you'd expect poets to sip syrupy drinks under pomegranate trees, where jasmine grows over clay walls, and servants pad silently in leather sandals across tiled floors. Here's where the magic happened, not just storing ice, but turning it into something decadent. You step through a wide doorway and into a shaded courtyard. At the center, a low stone table is still stained with rings of use. Beside it, a shallow pit lined with glazed blue tiles once held bowls packed with snow and fragrant syrups. You've stumbled into the home's dessert kitchen, the cooler, fragrant sister to the hotter, messier food kitchen next door. Imagine this scene: a servant enters with a polished bronze tray, glistening with droplets of condensation. Upon it, chilled bowls of faluda, those slender rice noodles drenched in rosewater and lime. The guests lean forward. The first spoon clinks. And in a land where shade is a luxury, the taste of cold sweetness is pure sorcery. Now, faluda isn't quite like the ice cream you know. It's chewy, it's grainy, and it's shockingly cold in the most satisfying way. Historians believe it dates back to at least 400 BCE, though some even argue for earlier variants, because, of course, historians still argue over everything from ingredients to serving bowls. The base was simple: starch noodles made from wheat or rice, cooled and mixed with snow or ice. Then came the flavoring: rosewater, always, then perhaps a touch of sour cherry syrup, bitter orange, or even saffron. Some versions were even spiked with vinegar for a tangy bite. Sweet, sour, floral, cold, the full sensory blitz of the Persian table. And it wasn't just about taste. In Zoroastrian culture, cold foods had symbolic meaning. They represented balance, counteracting the fire and heat of both climate and temperament. Offering faluda to a guest wasn't just a flex. It was a gesture of equilibrium. A spiritual ice cube. One fringe text even mentions a version of frozen drink served at royal New Year's festivals, where snow was packed into tall goblets layered with fruit pulp and crushed nuts. Basically the world's first snow cone. Were they exaggerating? Maybe. But there are reliefs on Achaemenid walls that show servants carrying large amphorae of something cold and dripping. Coincidence? You slip your fingers across the tile rim of the pit. Smooth. Still cool to the touch, even after all these centuries. The perfect serving zone. Let's peel back another delicious layer: how they made it all happen. It wasn't just about having snow or ice. It was the entire orchestration behind it: timing, storage, and technique. Ice was brought out sparingly. Often, it was shaved or chipped directly into bowls, then quickly covered in a chilled syrup. No scooping. No massive tubs. No waffle cones, sorry. Instead, your ice cream was more like an edible perfume. A sensory event. You didn't scarf it down. You experienced it. Some versions used fruit pulp whipped into frozen syrup, layered like an ancient granita. Others used clay molds to shape the snow into little domes. Still others relied on shallow metal trays to make early versions of sorbet. But the common thread? The magic of transience. These desserts melted fast. You had to savor them now, or watch them vanish. And here's a quirky tidbit: there are writings that suggest certain Persian physicians used frozen desserts as medicine. Yep, got a fever? Try some ice syrup. It's no NyQuil, but hey, you'll enjoy the side effects. You imagine the clink of bronze spoons, the flick of wrist as syrup is poured, the quick dart of a tongue to catch a melting drop. Ice wasn't just a science, it was a theater. And where there's theater, there's competition. By the time you reach the later dynasties, Sassanid, early Islamic, there's strong evidence that noble families competed over who could serve the most elaborate frozen desserts. One anecdote talks about a princess whose wedding menu included no fewer than 7 types of flavored snow, each paired with a specific poem. Think dessert flight meets epic poetry slam. The wealthy hired specialist chefs, not just cooks. These masters of cold were trained in the timing, flavor balancing, and even the geometry of ice presentation. Some worked only during the hot months, living near the yachtals and overseeing ice delivery and storage. Their job was to make summer taste like art. And just imagine the logistics: servants dashing across courtyards with covered bowls, dabbing at dripping rims with linen, trying to beat the sun by seconds. Every spoonful a race against time. A miracle, melting in your mouth. You step away from the courtyard and feel a bit warmer now. Not from the heat, but from appreciation. The ancient Persians didn't just invent a way to cool desserts in the desert. They built an entire culture around it. From engineering to poetry, medicine to celebration, their relationship with cold was as refined as their palaces. And you? You're starting to crave a bowl of something frosty. You walk with a little more spring in your step now. There's something energizing about knowing that, thousands of years ago, someone stood in this exact spot and thought, let's make the world's hottest desert taste like snow. That kind of optimism doesn't just cool the body, it tickles the soul. Ahead of you now is a structure that seems off. Not ruined. Just oddly shaped. A broad, low building with a sloping, almost squashed dome and no obvious door. But walk around the side, and you find a small opening that leads downward into the earth. This isn't a house or temple. It's a storage vault. A private ice cellar. And inside, you'll find one of the lesser-known stars of Persian cold tech, the Sard-B. Sard-Bes weren't quite yachtals. They didn't make ice, they simply preserved it. Think of them as the ancient Persian equivalent of a wine cellar crossed with a freezer, minus the wine, and also the freezer. But somehow still cold. You duck into the entrance, and the temperature shifts immediately. The air becomes still. Heavier. Cooler. This isn't a windcatcher-fed room, it's subterranean insulation at work. Sard-Bes were dug deep, often lined with bricks soaked in mud, reinforced with stone, and sealed with lime plaster to ward off pests and moisture. And here's where the genius kicks in: above the Sard-B, some houses had a small garden or courtyard pool. Why? Because the evaporation from that surface, coupled with shade and airflow, created an air cushion that pressed cooler air downward, right into the cellar beneath. Now, your eyes adjust to the gloom. The floor here isn't flat, it's gently sloped. Water drips from one side into a narrow trench. And stacked along the sides? Large ceramic jars, some still intact. These once held preserved fruits, vinegar syrups, and, you guessed it, ice. Not blocks, mind you. The Persians weren't hauling around bricks of ice like cartoon Vikings. Instead, they chipped, shaved, or crushed the stuff into ceramic containers, then insulated them in layers of straw or cloth. These containers were rotated, tended, monitored. You weren't just storing ice, you were curating it. There's even an old traveler's account from the 10th century describing a nobleman's Sard-B that was so cold, the walls would weep like a mountain in spring. Was that poetic flourish? Probably. But you can still see salt staining the bricks here. The air feels like the back of a cave. So maybe not too poetic. And while most Sard-Bes were practical, some were borderline luxurious. Marble floors. Inlaid mosaics. Decorative niches for perfumed oils. Yes, people had designer cold rooms before electricity. Because if you're going to go through the trouble of beating the desert, you might as well make it Instagram-worthy. It's no surprise that scholars argue over the Sardb's origins. Some link it to Mesopotamian cooling chambers. Others claim it was uniquely Persian. The only thing they agree on? It worked. Let's zoom out for a moment. All this talk of ice and shadow and clay might make you think that only the wealthy had access to these marvels. But here's the truth, while the rich enjoyed custom-made cold chambers, the common people had community cooling systems too. Public Sardbs weren't uncommon in larger towns. You'd find them attached to bazaars, bathhouses, even mosques. Some were shared by neighborhoods. In Yazd and Kerman, there were entire guilds, yes, guilds, responsible for maintaining communal ice stores. These folks were the ice librarians of their time. Imagine it, a teenage boy hauling a small ceramic jar through winding alleys to a public Sardb. He trades a copper coin and a small favor, maybe a poem, maybe a melon, and receives his daily ration of ice in return. It's not much. But on a 40°C afternoon, the chilled melon becomes nectar of the gods. Even public feasts and religious ceremonies took cold into account. Water sellers carried chilled carafes. Faluda vendors balanced trays of shaved snow with cloth-covered syrup pots. They were the air conditioning system of the street, mobile, fragrant, temporary. And what's a quirky footnote without an animal? Some rural villages allegedly trained mules to carry wrapped snow blocks down from highlands using shaded, straw-padded satchels. Basically, ancient refrigerated delivery donkeys. You step out of the Sardb now, blinking in the sun. Your skin prickles as the desert heat returns, and you think, not for the first time, how did they do it? How did an empire manage such fine control over something as slippery and stubborn as ice? Here's a thought, maybe the answer wasn't just technology or planning. Maybe it was obsession. An empire obsessed with contrast. With balance. With knowing that the sweetness of summer only shines brighter when tempered by snow. And they passed that obsession down. Later Persian dynasties inherited the blueprints. Safavids rebuilt Sardbs into palace wings. Qajars added stained glass windows that refracted cool light onto their cold stores. Even today, some traditional homes in Yazd still have functioning Sardbs, not for ice, perhaps, but for dried fruit, oil, and silence. Because silence, after all, is one of the coldest, calmest things there is. You find a spot beneath a fig tree, just outside the vault. A breeze tickles your face. A goat bleats somewhere in the distance, unimpressed by your existential reflection. But still, you smile. They built cold into the desert. And not with machines. With air, water, earth, and time. And you? You're just starting to grasp the edges of their brilliance. You rise from the shade of that fig tree, dust off your robe, okay, imaginary robe, and follow the sound of something sharper than silence, tools at work. Not the clang of blacksmiths or the rhythm of masons, but the careful scrape and chisel of someone shaping clay. Not just any clay, this is the stuff of Persian cooling tech's most underrated superstar, the ceramic artisan. See, if ice was the treasure and yachtals were the vaults, then these clay vessels were the jewel cases. You wander toward a small workshop tucked beside a hillside. No massive kill here. Just a long shelter, open to the air, and shelves stacked with glistening, sun-drying jars. Not pottery for soup. Not amphorae for wine. These are designed for the cold. The potter greets you with a nod, wipes sweat from his forehead, and lifts a nearly finished jar. It's wider at the base, narrows at the top, and has these tiny ribs circling the belly. Those aren't just for decoration. They help condensation form and trickle evenly, a cooling trick thousands of years old. He beckons you closer. You reach out, touching the clay as he explains, these jars were porous by design. Just porous enough to allow evaporation, which draws heat away. Think of them as the OG mini-fridges. Store your snow shavings, sweet syrups, or Faluda noodles in one of these, and it might stay cold for hours longer than in any other material. No electricity. No steel. Just mud, sweat, and a whole lot of science disguised as tradition. The process is hypnotic. Clay is scooped from riverbeds miles away, soaked, filtered, then aged under burlap for days before it's ready. The shaping is done by hand, no spinning wheels here. Every turn of the wrist is practiced. Each groove has purpose. And the kill? A squat dome tucked behind the workshop, fired with dry dung and scrub brush. Inside, it reaches temperatures that would make your eyebrows curl, enough to transform clay into a hardened, slightly porous container that still breathes just enough to wick away heat. Now here's a quirky footnote: some vessels were seasoned with rosewater before first use. Not for smell, though yes, that was a bonus, but because artisans believed it taught the clay to hold cold better. Is that science? Is that superstition? Historians still argue over whether it had any measurable thermal effect, but the tradition endured for centuries. Some of these jars had metal rims embedded into the lip, not gold or silver, but hammered bronze. The idea was that metal would stay cooler and help form a tighter seal when covered. A clever detail that shows just how intimately these people understood temperature, even without thermometers. You watch the potter seal a jar with wax linen. He winks. Give this 3 hours in the shade, you'll have the coldest melon slice in the whole village. You believe him. Now, take a moment to think about scale. This wasn't 1 or 2 master potters turning out a few jars a month. In major cities like Ray, Isfahan, and Shiraz, there were entire districts devoted to ceramics, and many of those pieces were custom designed for cooling. Some had triple walls, with ash or straw packed in between. Others had built-in drip channels or spouts for melting runoff. The innovation wasn't random. It was intentional, born of experience, experimentation, and let's be real, some good old-fashioned gossip. Hey, Masood's pot kept the lemon sherbet cold till midnight. What's his mix ratio? 1 weird variant? Jars designed not to cool what was inside, but what was around them. Yep. Picture a tall ceramic vase filled with ice, placed in the middle of a room. As the vessel cooled, it radiated cold air outward, essentially acting like a medieval air conditioner. Elite homes would sometimes place 2 of these opposite each other in summer salons, creating a makeshift cold corridor. And of course, each jar bore a signature. A maker's mark. A fingerprint. Sometimes even a small poem etched into the base. One fragment unearthed in central Iran reads, "Chill within, fire without, may your drink always outlast the sun." Poetry. On a fridge. Eat your heart out. Gee. You lean back now, letting the potter return to his rhythm. That soft rasp of clay shaping to palm, the crackle of brushwood in the kiln, the perfume of wet earth baking to permanence, it's all part of a larger story. One where every element had a part to play. This wasn't about having a single magic device. The ancient Persians didn't rely on one trick. They combined systems. They layered engineering, artistry, and cultural ritual. From the snowy mountains to the desert valleys, they wove ice into the very architecture of daily life. Even the smallest tools, like a well-shaped jar, were acts of resistance against heat. Of saying, yes, the sun is relentless. But we're clever. And we like dessert. You head out from the workshop, fingers dusty with clay, feet crunching against broken shards that never made it. Some cracked in the kiln. Others failed the cooling test. But all of them are part of the story. And the potter? He gives you one last look, like he knows what you're really asking. Could this old mud jar really keep a sorbet cold in the desert? Yes. Yes, it could. And in the ancient world, that counted as a miracle. You keep walking, this time following the smell of something sweet. Not clay, not damp stone, but sugar. Or more specifically, the memory of sugar, lingering like a perfume in the air. You're headed toward the bustling center of an ancient Persian city, and while the Yakchuls and Sardbes kept the ice, this is where the magic happened, the ice cream maker's district. Well, okay, they didn't call it that. But close enough. Here, in the labyrinth of sun-soaked alleyways and shadowy courtyards, was where vendors, cooks, and alchemists of flavor gathered. And tonight, because time works differently in dream narratives like this, you arrive just in time for the crafting of Faluda. You know Faluda, right? It's one of the oldest cold desserts in the world, still sold today in Iranian shops and ice cream parlors. Long, slippery noodles made from rice starch, drenched in rosewater, lime juice, and chilled almost to freezing with crushed ice or snow. It's not gelato. It's not sorbet. It's something else entirely: cool, fragrant, chewy, and somehow more refreshing than plain water. As you step into the shaded workspace of one Faluda master, the tools of the trade are already in motion: a copper bowl, freshly shaved ice, a jar of bright pink syrup, and a tray of sticky white noodles that look like something between jellyfish and glass threads. He doesn't speak, just gestures for you to sit and watch. Because what you're about to see isn't just dessert, it's ritual. The process begins with the ice, of course it does. The crushed snow is scooped from a cloth-lined basin that's been tucked into a shady alcove. It's the kind of granular, crunchy ice that crackles between your teeth. Not too wet. Not too dry. Just right for absorbing flavor. Next comes the starch noodles. They're pressed from a wooden mold with holes like a spaghetti press. Except this one's been handed down for generations. The dough is soft but firm, a mix of rice flour and water boiled just long enough to bind, then cooled in a shallow pan until it sets into a quivering sheet. One twist, and the whole thing unrolls like edible ribbon. The master places a handful of those noodles over the ice, then ladles on a syrup so fragrant it's almost dizzying, rosewater with a splash of sour cherry extract. A handful of ground pistachios. A squeeze of lime. One stir. Two. And suddenly, you're not in the desert anymore. You're inside a snow-dusted poem. You take a bite. It's cold. It's floral. It's a little chewy and a little slushy. And if your tongue had a memory, it would remember this moment forever. Some say Faluda came from Shiraz first. Others argue it began in Tabriz, brought south by merchants and reinterpreted along the way. Historians still debate its origins. Was it Persian from the start, or inspired by dishes from India or China? There's no consensus. But everyone agrees it's been around a long, long time. You glance around the small shop. It's barely more than a courtyard and a shade-cloth roof, but it has everything a Faluda master needs: ice basin, noodle press, jars of syrup, and a carved block of salt tucked under the table, used to keep the cold lingering longer when ice gets scarce. That salt is a subtle clue. Because while Yakchals and Sardbest did the heavy lifting, these shopkeepers had their own tricks. A bowl lined with wet linen, placed atop a slab of stone sprinkled with salt, could keep a dessert chilled for hours. Add a light breeze? Instant freezer. And they didn't stop at Faluda. You ask, mouth still tingling, if there were other cold treats. The master raises one eyebrow, turns, and gestures toward a second table. There, a boy is preparing akavan sherbet, a mixture of snow, pomegranate molasses, and crushed mint leaves. He adds a splash of vinegar. Wait, vinegar? Yep. Because sour plus sweet plus cold equals Persian summer perfection. It hits your throat like peppermint lightning. You blink. Then you grin. Here's a quirky detail: certain towns were famous for their syrups. Kashan for rose. Kazvin for sour cherry. And every city swore its recipe was the most authentic, the most healing, the most refreshing. Some even claimed their sherbets had spiritual benefits, cooling the soul as much as the body. And let's not forget those poetic street hawkers. They chant in the markets, snow from heaven. Syrup of paradise. Drawing crowds with their trays of shaved delight. You lean back against a mud brick wall, slurping the last bite of your Faluda, and sigh. Not because you're full, but because you're starting to understand how much of Persian cold culture was about joy. Not just engineering. Not just survival. But delight. They could have just stored ice. Could have rationed it. Treated it like a rare mineral. But instead, they turned it into experiences. Into festivals. Into love poems in bowls. You picture a nobleman tossing snowballs to laughing children during Nowruz, the Persian New Year. A bride's dowry including a silver Faluda spoon. A man walking hours to buy saffron syrup from a famous vendor, all for one perfect slush. This wasn't just about cooling off. It was about cooling down, physically, mentally, emotionally. About reminding yourself that yes, life can be unbearably hot, but also unbearably sweet. And as the sun slips lower in the sky, you realize you're not sweating anymore. Because they didn't just build cold into their architecture. They built it into their hearts. And yours? Yours is now just a little cooler, too. You stroll through the city just as twilight paints everything gold, but your ears catch something unexpected: bells. Soft, rhythmic, metallic, like someone shaking a charm bracelet in slow motion. You follow the sound and find a man walking alongside a donkey cart, its wooden wheels bumping over cobblestones. He's singing, too, something light, melodic, barely above a whisper. The cart stacked with wide, shallow trays. On top of each is a circular slab of ice, wrapped in cloth, and beneath them, nestled into carved compartments, are rows of glass jars, each holding different colored syrups: saffron yellow, pomegranate red, rosewater pink, minty green. You found one of the traveling coldmen, a vendor bringing winter in a wagon. These people weren't just delivermen, they were cooling legends. Part street performer, part chemist, part endurance athlete. Their job? Distribute ice and cold treats throughout the city before sunset. Because even with all that genius ice storage we've talked about, there was still a need for daily delivery. Not everyone had access to a private yachtule, especially in crowded neighborhoods. So these guys became mobile climate miracles, rolling out from shaded depots each morning with carefully insulated carts. Some even had small yachtule-style containers built directly into the wagon's belly, ceramic-lined with straw insulation and sealed with wax. Clever. Wildly inefficient by modern standards, but enough to keep Faluda cool in the city heat for several hours. The moment a cart entered a market or courtyard, it would ring those tiny bells, not just for attention, but to signal a kind of miracle in progress. You step closer to the vendor, watching as he begins his little performance. First, he grabs a mallet and gently taps at one of the ice slabs, shaving it with a wide iron spoon into a waiting bowl. He moves quickly, practiced. Every second matters before the chill slips away. Then he points at you. A question without words: which syrup? You pick saffron. He nods, unseals the golden jar, and lets a stream of thick, fragrant liquid spiral into the crushed ice. A sprinkle of ground rose petals. A dash of cinnamon. He offers it with a flourish and a grin like he's just cast a spell. You taste it. It's absurdly cold, sweet, faintly bitter, and ridiculously good. Now here's a fun fact: these syrup mixtures weren't just based on taste, they were rooted in Persian medicine. According to ancient texts, each syrup had a humoral property: hot, cold, moist, or dry, and was believed to balance the body. Rosewater was considered cooling and moist, ideal for fevers or summer exhaustion. Saffron? Warming in the winter, but used in small summer doses to invigorate the heart. So no, you weren't just eating dessert. You were rebusing your elemental energies. And possibly curing heartbreak while you were at it. The vendor pours a bit of vinegar over a second bowl, yes, again with the vinegar, and hands it to a boy who grins like he's just won the lottery. Then another bowl. Then another. The cart becomes a stage, and the crowd, hungry for cold. You begin to notice how carefully this man guards his ice. He wraps the used slab in cloth again, hides it beneath another towel, then secures the whole top layer with a slab of slate. Not heavy, just dark enough to absorb some sun, but polished to reflect the rest. A balance of insulation and misdirection. This wasn't accidental. Traveling coldmen were often trained by older masters in ice preservation. The techniques passed down were secretive, even spiritual. Stories tell of one vendor who swore he could keep ice solid for 2 days with nothing but a hollowed-out watermelon rind and a layer of ash. Historians are still puzzled by some of these claims. Were they exaggeration? Were there unknown methods lost to time? Or were these just clever ways to market your cart as the coolest in town? One weird tradition? Some vendors added myrtle leaves to the insulation. Why? Some believe they calmed the ice, keeping its spirit intact. That's either poetic nonsense or the first recorded instance of thermal aromatherapy. Either way, it worked for him. And don't forget competition. In cities like Isfahan, there were dozens of traveling cold men, each with a signature style. One used silver bowls. Another sang in Turkish. A third rode a goat cart with horns painted gold. Yeah. Goat cart. That guy was a hit at festivals. You step aside as the vendor packs up. The sun's dipping fast now, and his ice is almost gone. But his cart is lighter, his purse heavier, and the smiles he's left behind? Priceless. You trail behind him a while longer, noticing how even in these final moments, he's meticulous. Scraping the last shards of ice into a clean jar. Tying down the lids. Whispering a short prayer to Sam the Cold Keeper, a local saint believed to protect perishables. Possibly fictional. Possibly brilliant branding. Either way, a name known in every alleyway. As you watch him disappear into the streets, you start to realize that ice was more than a substance. It was an event. An arrival. A break in the heat. A shared joy. And those traveling vendors? They were more than deliverermen. They were bearers of mercy, disguised as salesmen. Because for just one coin, you could taste winter in the middle of a desert summer. And somehow, for a few melting minutes, everything felt right. You lean against a wall, your bowl empty now, your fingers still cold, and wonder. How did they do it? How did they keep it all so beautifully, stubbornly cool? And why, even now, does the memory make your spine tingle? You wander again, bare feet on warm flagstones, sun nearly gone, the city slipping into that blue hour where shadows stretch and soften. But something draws you away from the noise. Past the carts. Past the bells. Toward the edges of town. And that's where you find them. Not palaces. Not marketplaces. But gardens. Sprawling, symmetrical, enclosed spaces filled with fruit trees, water channels, raised terraces, and stone pavilions. You step through a low-arched gate, and suddenly everything goes still. The air is cooler here, the breeze sharper. Somewhere ahead, water trickles through a carved channel. You're inside a Persian paradise garden, or paradisa, yep, that's where the word paradise comes from. And in the middle of this lush symmetry? A quiet, squat, mud brick building with a dome. Not a yakchal this time. A shadowy, or underground summer retreat. This isn't just where people stored ice, it's where they hid themselves from the heat. A place to retreat, restore, and cool down from the inside out. You duck inside. The air wraps around you like velvet soaked in river mist. No fans. No machines. Just centuries-old architectural chill logic doing its job. The shadowy is dim, but not claustrophobic. Its domed ceiling traps the rising heat, forcing it upward and out through narrow vents. Meanwhile, air from the garden outside is drawn through qanats, underground channels that flow beneath the walls, acting like a subterranean air conditioner. You sit on a raised stone bench, and immediately your skin prickles with coolness. This is where Persian nobility would drink cold sherbet, read poetry, or just lie back and let time melt. No scrolls. No labor. Just quiet. The world above, frantic and sunburned, might as well be another planet. Some sardbes were used seasonally, sealed off for winter, then cleaned and prepared as spring crept in. Others, especially those in noble homes or mosques, were used year-round for meditation and medicine. The science of space itself became the healer. And these weren't rustic caves, either. We're talking decorated domes, tiled floors, calligraphy on the walls. One shadowy in still shows traces of turquoise paint and gold leaf Quranic verses. Chilling with style. Quirky side note? Some wealthier homes had multi-level sard-bes. Like a cool room beneath the cool room. Think of it as premium chill mode. Historians still argue whether these were for added insulation or to impress guests. Or maybe both. Because honestly, if you had a 2-story fridge lounge, wouldn't you brag? You find a small tray left behind, ceramic, chipped, but still gorgeous. On it, the faded stains of something sweet. Probably Faluda. Maybe saffron syrup. Maybe a sherbet of melon and cucumber, popular in southern regions where the heat got truly brutal. The walls around you were once lined with woven mats soaked in rosewater. As the air passed over them, it picked up the scent, cooling you physically and emotionally. In some sard-bes, people even hung wet linens from ceiling hooks, letting evaporation do the work. No electricity. Just physics, patience, and perfume. You lie back and close your eyes. For a second, it's easy to forget the 21st century. To forget cars, phones, deadlines, and AC units that hum louder than your thoughts. Here, it's just stone and scent and soft, steady breath. And that's the genius of Persian cooling culture. It wasn't just about ice. It was about creating a cold state of mind. A total body experience. No surprise then that sard-bes became places for storytelling. Love poems whispered in shadow. Epic tales traded like treasure under domed ceilings. You imagine a storyteller crouched on that far step, reciting the Shahnameh by heart while listeners sip chilled apricot juice and exhale slowly, fully. Time bends in this place. You rise, reluctantly, and step out into the garden again. Night has fallen, and now the garden glows. Tiny oil lamps flicker. Fragrance floats. And up above, the stars seem closer somehow, like the ceiling to a different sard-bes, this one infinite and hung with light. You walk the edge of the pool, dipping your toes, listening to the silence between frog croaks and fig branches creaking. The garden and sard-bes weren't isolated features, they were parts of the same ecosystem. A cooling system for the soul, layered and interlinked. You realize how interconnected it all was, the ice from the yakchal, the syrups from the bazaar, the vendors in the streets, and the sard-bes in the gardens. They weren't separate inventions, they were nodes in a network designed to outwit the sun. And tonight? It worked. You're not hot. You're not sticky. You're not gasping. You're just cool. In every sense of the word. So you lean back, arms behind your head, and think. No wonder they called this paradise. They built it. You leave the garden reluctantly, dragging your fingertips along the smooth, vine-wrapped wall one last time. The city's winding down, lanterns flickering on, the air beginning to soften. But your curiosity still burns like a coal tucked under your ribs. There's one more thing pulling you, you want to see how the ice was made. Not just stored. Not just shipped. But created. So you slip back toward the city's edge, past rows of adobe homes, past another yakchal, you're getting good at spotting them, until you reach a long, low trench, rectangular, sunken, flanked by tall mud brick walls on each side. It looks like an ancient bowling alley, if bowling alleys ended in miracles. This is the ice-making basin, sometimes called a maideni yagda, literally, ice field. It's where the real magic happened. And the trick? It wasn't about adding cold, it was about subtracting heat. You crouch beside the basin and picture it in winter, a shallow pool of water poured in just before sunset, left overnight under the open sky, and frozen solid by dawn. Not because it was snowing, it wasn't, and not because someone waved a wand, but because the Persians had mastered radiative cooling long before anyone called it that. So here's the cheat code: on clear, dry desert nights, the heat from objects, like, say, a pool of water, radiates upward into the sky. If the walls around the basin are tall enough, they block warm winds and insulate from residual heat. Meanwhile, the water loses energy faster than it absorbs it, and boom, ice forms. Naturally. Repeatedly. Reliably. You walk down into the trench and press your hand against the earth. Still cool, hours after sunset. The basin was always shallow, just a few centimeters of water at a time. Why? Thinner layers froze faster. Every night, a fresh batch of icy sheets would appear like quiet gifts from the stars. In the morning, workers would scrape up the ice with wooden paddles, stack it on sledges, wrap it in straw or burlap, and hustle it toward the yachtchel. Repeat this for days. Weeks. All winter long. By spring, the ice dome would be full and ready to chill a city. Here's a quirky historical tidbit: some workers believed singing certain tunes while scraping ice would keep the sheets from cracking. Like lullabies for frozen water. Whether or not it worked, it kept them warm. And maybe kept the rhythm steady. But this wasn't a job for the faint of heart. You imagine being one of these workers. You'd rise in the middle of the night, because that was prime freezing time. The sun had long set, and now the desert flipped its switch from furnace to freezer. Your breath fogs in the moonlight. Your hands stiffen as you check the walls for wind gaps. You pour the water from leather buckets into smooth channels. Then you wait. Not long. Maybe just hours. By 3 a.m., the top layer starts to crystallize. And by dawn, you've got a shimmering sheet, delicate as sugar glass. Historians still argue whether workers used special formulas in the water. Some claim ash or salts were added to speed up cooling, others think that would have interfered with storage. No records confirm it, but the legend of the salt bearer still pops up in local stories. One thing's for sure, it wasn't just about freezing, it was about harvesting, preserving, protecting. Anyone could get water to freeze on a rare cold night. But keeping it frozen through June? That was art. And no surprise, the people who did it had a certain swagger. You hear footsteps behind you, another traveler, maybe. But no, it's just the wind kicking up dust, spiraling through the trench like a whisper from the past. You stand again and look up at the sky. That's what made all this work. Not magic. Not electricity. Space itself. The wide-open desert sky was the final ingredient. It acted like a cosmic vent, letting heat escape from the Earth into the void. Without clouds or humidity, that heat vanished fast. You glance around the basin, empty now, but still sacred in a way. Even without water, it holds the memory of winter-born treasures, of shivering workers humming in moonlight, of carts clattering toward domes of frost. And all for what? So someone, somewhere, could lift a spoonful of Faluda to their lips on a July afternoon and whisper, "Ah." Because in ancient Persia, making ice wasn't just survival, it was delight. It was luxury woven into labor, and science disguised as ritual. You climb out of the trench, brushing dust from your knees, and grin. You're starting to see the genius of it all. You're starting to feel just how deep the chill goes. Let's rewind. Historians trace the origins of Faluda back to around 400 BCE, though some argue it may have appeared even earlier in Achaemenid court kitchens. Originally called paloode, the name refers to the process of straining, because the noodles are hand-pressed through a sieve, a kind of ancient pasta extruder that could double as a gym workout. You picture a cook in a brick-walled kitchen, sleeves rolled, sweating despite the cool sard bee behind him. A pot of wheat starch bubbles on the fire. Once thick enough, he spreads it onto cold slabs to set, then scrapes and strains it into long, thin threads. They weren't just making dessert. They were crafting seasonal joy. Served during Nowruz, the Persian New Year, Faluda became a symbol of renewal, cold against heat, softness against harshness, sugar against spice. But here's a fringe fact for dessert nerds: some recipes included camphor or frankincense for added aroma. Imagine biting into your lemon slush and getting a gentle hint of ancient incense. That's some next-level historical flavor fusion. And this wasn't just street food. Royal versions were studded with ground pistachios, candied violets, even silver leaf. Because if you're cooling ice in the desert, why not go full glam? As you chew slowly, because cold and brain freeze are still a thing, even in history, the vendor gestures toward a jug hanging from the cart's canopy, rosewater, thick and syrupy. He drizzles some onto the next scoop without asking. That's the rule here: rosewater is not optional. It was always the fragrance that made Faluda transcendent. Rosewater distilled from damask roses, often harvested just after dawn, added the final sensory snap. And making that rosewater? A whole tradition of its own. The Persian town of Kashan still holds annual rose festivals every May, where the petals are steamed in copper stills, their essence caught in curving glass coils. The scent drifts for miles. The bottles are sealed. And then, months later, poured over your slush. The first bite is icy. The second is syrupy. The third? You don't even notice the heat anymore. Here's a debate scholars love to poke at: was Faluda invented for pleasure or for cooling therapy? Some say it was recommended by physicians to lower body temperature and reduce inner heat. Others insist it was a court luxury, designed to impress foreign envoys and keep nobility smug and smugger. Maybe it was both. Maybe it still is. You slurp the last of your bowl just as the lanterns on the street start to dim. The vendor wipes his hands on a cloth and nods to you like you've passed some sort of delicious test. You return the nod, spirit high and stomach oddly refreshed. And here's a twist: Faluda didn't stay put. It migrated. As empires rose and fell, Faluda found new homes across the region. In India, it mingled with kulfi. In the Ottoman Empire, it blended into Sharbak culture. And in modern-day Iran, it married another iconic sweet, Bastani sunnoti, Persian saffron ice cream. Yep, ice cream and noodle slush. In the same bowl. Some might call that a crime. You call it evolution. You walk back under the stars, the buzz of sugar humming gently in your ears. What started as cold water in a desert has become a legacy of frozen celebration, chilled by moonlight, flavored with flowers, passed from dynasty to dynasty. And you? You are now part of that history too, sticky lips, full heart, and all. You're walking slower now, lulled by the sweetness, your mind still chasing the slippery noodles in that bowl. But the story's not done yet. Not by a long shot. Because if there's one thing the ancient Persians did even better than making cold, it was organizing how cold was used. Like a frozen version of an empire, layered, structured, and astonishingly efficient. And so tonight, you get to sneak into the Saad B. No, not a spooky underground dungeon. The Saad B was the cool chamber beneath many Persian homes. Think of it like a reverse attic, sunken, shadowed, and whisper cold even in brutal summer. Families stored ice, fruit, pickles, rosewater, and sometimes even sleeping mats in these rooms. Because yes, sometimes it was too hot to sleep upstairs. You duck beneath a narrow stone archway and descend 5 worn steps. The air shifts immediately. The temperature drops at least 10 degrees. You exhale slowly, half in awe, half in relief. Even now, the walls feel like they're holding on to the ghost of winter. This space? It was priceless. So priceless that invading armies would sometimes demand control over cold storage before seizing temples or treasuries. You know your kingdom's serious about dessert when ice is a military asset. The walls of the Saad B are thick, a meter or more of mud brick and clay, sometimes reinforced with natural lime to resist heat seepage. Some had air shafts, known as badgers, that acted like ancient AC systems, pulling cool wind downward and venting warm air up and out. You stand beneath one now, and yep, you feel the faintest breeze curling around your wrist. No fans. No electricity. Just physics and patience. Here's the daily routine: a servant or family member would rise early to fetch a small block of ice from the nearby yachtchel. It would be wrapped in straw or placed in a ceramic jar, then carried, carefully, always carefully, down into the Saad B. There, it would slowly melt, chilling everything around it and leaving behind fresh water for drinking or cooking. A historian once joked that ancient Persians didn't invent the refrigerator, they built themselves inside one. He wasn't wrong. Quirky footnote: some Saad-Bes had poetry etched on their lintels, lines from Hafez or Ferdowsi, reminding guests to speak softly and enjoy the stillness. Imagine opening your modern fridge and seeing a verse about humility instead of a ketchup bottle. You settle onto a low stone bench carved into the Saad B wall. Your back presses against the cool plaster. For a moment, it's just you, the dark, and the deep hush of the earth. This wasn't just a room. It was a retreat. Kids would play down here. Grandmothers would nap. Ice would sweat slowly in clay bowls, and someone would be slicing melons onto copper trays. The shadowy turned ice into living comfort. Historians still argue whether these rooms were common in peasant homes or limited to the wealthy. Some archaeological digs suggest even modest houses had some form of subterranean cool storage. Others argue that true shadows, with airflow designs and insulation, were elite luxuries. Maybe it depends on where you look, or whose history you read. You run your fingers along the wall again, wondering how many stories it holds. How many hands reached out, just like yours, pressing in to borrow the cold? Because that's what it was. Borrowed. A brief gift from winter, carried forward by brilliant design and determined labor. When you finally climb back up the stairs, the night greets you like a breath held too long. The moon is higher. The wind quieter. But something in you has shifted. You've seen the systems now, and not just the structures. The flow. The planning. The absolute genius of turning a deadly environment into a freezer, a kitchen, a comfort zone. And yet, it never felt industrial. It felt personal. Sacred, even. Each part of the system, Yakchal, Basin, shadowy, Faluda, was a thread in a fabric that wrapped itself around generations. No one needed a thermostat. They had tradition. No one needed instructions. They had memory. You walk home slowly, like someone carrying something fragile and irreplaceable. Because in a way, you are. You're carrying the memory of ice that never should have existed, made by hands long turned to dust, under stars that haven't changed. And somehow, you're colder than you've been all night. Chilled. Grateful. Wide awake. Just as the ancient Persians would have wanted. The narrative reveals a critical development as the protagonist uncovers a hidden truth buried beneath layers of deception. This discovery begins with a seemingly minor inconsistency, a forgotten name, a misdated letter, a misplaced artifact, that gradually unfolds into a larger, far-reaching revelation. The environment reflects this shift. Once familiar places now feel alien and distorted, mirroring the internal disorientation of the character. The tone shifts subtly, adopting a more introspective rhythm as the protagonist grapples with the implications of this newfound knowledge. Memories previously thought to be reliable are now questioned. The timeline fractures slightly, past and present begin to intermingle more fluidly. Dialogue becomes sparse but loaded with subtext, each word chosen carefully, hesitation between lines hinting at internal conflict. Supporting characters begin to either recede or sharpen in significance depending on their connection to the truth being uncovered. Trust becomes a focal tension. Visual symbolism grows stronger here. Reflections, shadows, and mirrors take on thematic importance. For example, a broken mirror might appear during a moment of internal crisis, signifying a fractured identity or realization. Weather plays a role as well. Fog, rain, or shifting light patterns accompany the growing confusion and eventual clarity. The protagonist embarks on a silent investigation, searching old records, revisiting childhood places, confronting forgotten acquaintances. There is a palpable sense of urgency beneath the quietness, like a storm gathering behind calm clouds. Inner monologue becomes more frequent, revealing doubt, guilt, or even a creeping paranoia. This portion serves as a turning point not through action, but through the weight of revelation. The stakes are reframed. What was once perceived as a personal struggle is now clearly linked to a broader, perhaps systemic or historical, issue. A private lie is revealed to be part of a larger architecture of concealment. Flashbacks become more intrusive and vivid. They begin to bleed into present scenes, sometimes indistinguishably. This formal blurring emphasizes the protagonist's unraveling grip on temporal reality. Narration itself may shift, perhaps from first person to a more distant, unreliable third person, or vice versa, mirroring the instability of perspective. Sensory details intensify. Textures, like peeling wallpaper, dust in sunlight, sounds, a ticking clock, a forgotten song, and smells, old books, damp soil, all begin to serve narrative functions, triggering associations or guiding memory. There's an almost dreamlike, uncanny mood that blankets these passages. At this stage, doubt crystallizes into a need for confrontation. The protagonist resolves to face a key figure, someone who holds the missing piece of the story, or who has been complicit in the deception. The scene is set for this confrontation, often under emotionally or symbolically charged circumstances. The confrontation does not provide clean answers but instead opens up more complex emotional territory. Instead of pure betrayal or innocence, the truth is murky, built on choices made under pressure, silence justified by fear, and histories rewritten for survival. The antagonist, or keeper of secrets, is rendered with nuance. Themes of memory, identity, and constructed reality come to the forefront. The protagonist realizes that truth is not a single, buried object to be found, but a constellation of perspectives, omissions, and interpretations. What matters now is how they will live with what they know. The section closes on an unresolved but resonant note, a visual image, a lingering phrase, or a symbolic gesture that encapsulates the transformation undergone. The arc bends not toward closure, but toward complexity, which the narrative now embraces fully. A shift in tempo marks this new section. After the psychological and emotional weight of the previous revelations, the narrative now leans into momentum. There's movement, tension, and a sense that the story is accelerating toward a reckoning. The protagonist, now altered by what they've uncovered, begins to act with renewed purpose. Their posture, tone, and decision-making reflect this internal shift. The setting reflects this forward motion. Spaces once static or symbolic now become transitional. Train stations, stairwells, long corridors, and open roads dominate the visuals. These liminal spaces reinforce the idea that the protagonist is moving between states of being, ignorance and knowledge, paralysis and agency, confusion and clarity. There's a notable change in how time is handled. Events that once unfolded slowly or ambiguously now click into a more linear, almost procedural rhythm. The protagonist begins collecting facts, confronting people, testing assumptions with concrete actions. The story shifts from interpretation to confrontation. Characters who were once vague or peripheral now become central. A figure once glimpsed in passing might now re-enter the story in a new light, their role recontextualized by the protagonist's transformation. Dialogue sharpens, questions are more direct, evasions more obvious. A kind of investigative structure emerges, whether literally or metaphorically. The protagonist builds a case, timelines are mapped, contradictions logged, emotional responses analyzed. Yet, this is not purely about intellect, emotional intuition plays a major role. The protagonist now trusts their instincts more, relying on gut reactions, dreams, and emotional echoes to guide them through ambiguity. Symbolic motifs, objects, sounds, or even animals, recur with greater intensity and interconnectedness. What seemed incidental before now pulses with narrative weight. The reader begins to feel that everything means something, though not all meanings are immediately clear. Momentum builds, but so does resistance. The closer the protagonist gets to the core of the mystery, the more friction arises, external, from antagonistic forces, internal, from fear and self-doubt, and metaphysical, as the narrative world seems to resist revelation. Reality might warp slightly here, a clock stop, distances stretch, technology fails, symbols multiply. Relationships are tested. Allies hesitate or fracture, enemies reveal unexpected empathy or shared pain. A key betrayal or loss may occur in this part, something that knocks the protagonist off balance, forcing them to choose whether to retreat or press on. The structure of the narrative may start to echo the protagonist's mindset. Chapters might become fragmented, pacing may fluctuate, and language might become more poetic or hallucinatory. This formal experimentation serves to illustrate the emotional and existential intensity of this leg of the journey. Eventually, clarity begins to re-emerge, not as certainty, but as a calmness within ambiguity. The protagonist finds a way to act without full understanding, to move forward with incomplete information but a strong internal compass. This part typically features a small but powerful decision, one that doesn't resolve the plot but reshapes the protagonist's relation to it. Perhaps they destroy a piece of evidence instead of exposing it, or choose compassion over revenge. The choice marks maturity. The section closes with a sense of threshold. A door opens, literally or figuratively. The next step is not yet taken, but it is visible. The tone is quiet but charged. The protagonist, though battered, now stands more fully in their own identity, prepared to face whatever comes next. This section opens with stillness, a moment of eerie calm following the chaos and confrontation of the previous acts. The protagonist finds themselves in a space of pause, reflection, and recalibration. The external world seems muted, almost frozen, as if waiting for the next move. Time slows again, but this time not from confusion, rather from intention. Visually, the setting might be sparse, a quiet home, an empty field, a dawnlit road. Nature makes a subtle return, often signifying healing, memory, or cyclical patterns. Wind, trees, water, all play quiet, symbolic roles. Sound design leans on soft ambience, birdsong, ticking clocks, breathing. Inwardly, the protagonist is integrating past revelations. There is an effort to make meaning from what was uncovered, to connect the emotional with the factual, the personal with the systemic. Flashbacks reappear but now feel more grounded, less intrusive. They serve to explain rather than confuse. This moment of calm is not without tension. Beneath the surface lies anticipation, an understanding that the story is nearing its final turn. The protagonist reviews their position, what's been lost, what's been gained, and what remains unresolved. Lists may be made, maps consulted, or metaphors contemplated, like a chessboard, a puzzle, a machine. Secondary characters, once reactive, now seen to act with their own agency. The story widens slightly, hinting at consequences that extend beyond the protagonist alone. What was once a personal mystery now appears to have societal, even existential implications. This is also a place for quiet intimacy, a heartfelt conversation, an unspoken forgiveness, or a private ritual. Emotional restraint is key here. Rather than grand declarations, the scene breathes through subtle actions, a hand on a shoulder, a glance held too long, a long postponed letter finally opened. A symbolic gesture marks this part, something that physically represents transformation or release. The protagonist might burn old notes, bury an item from the past, or finally enter a space they'd always avoided. These gestures are not about closure, but continuity, acknowledging the past while no longer being held captive by it. Tone-wise, the narrative steps into quiet confidence. Language becomes cleaner, firmer. There's less hedging, fewer unanswered questions. It's not that everything is resolved, but the protagonist now feels capable of facing what isn't. A subtle reframing of earlier imagery occurs. Something once menacing, a locked door, a recurring shadow, a name left unspoken, now carries a different weight, maybe even peace. This shift signals that the story has begun to bend toward resolution, not through answers, but through resilience. This section ends with a preparatory beat, a deep breath before the final act. The protagonist has not won or conquered, but they've endured and evolved. They now step forward with a different relationship to fear, truth, and power. The final image is transitional, a threshold crossed, a light flicked off, footsteps receding into the unknown. The destination remains unrevealed, but the direction is clear. The story does not promise triumph, it promises motion. There's a thematic return to the beginning here, and not in repetition, but in echo. A word, object, or line of dialogue from the first chapters might reappear, now charged with new meaning. It's a quiet signal, the journey is almost complete, and everything meant something after all. The narrative enters its penultimate stride. This section is marked by convergence, threads of plot, character arcs, themes, and symbols begin to align. There's a magnetic pull toward resolution, and the protagonist is no longer wandering or reacting but choosing, asserting, leading. The setting reflects this clarity. Light becomes a dominant motif, sunlight breaking through storm clouds, lamps flickering on in dark places, or a space once shadowed now revealed. Architecture feels sharper, more defined, clean lines, open doors, intersecting paths. Dialogue returns with precision. Every exchange matters. There is less small talk or indirect speech, conversations cut to the bone. What was once hidden is now named, openly and without apology. The protagonist speaks truths once unthinkable, sometimes to others, sometimes to themselves. This portion revisits earlier events with new eyes. The protagonist may retrace steps, return to places from the first act, re-meet characters from a different angle, or reread letters or journals that once confused them. But this time, they see clearly. Layers fall away. Narrative perspective may stabilize here. If the story previously toyed with multiple viewpoints or shifts in tense, it now chooses one, reflecting the protagonist's newfound internal unity. The fragmented becomes coherent. There is often a moment of reckoning, not explosive, but quiet and undeniable. A truth is confirmed, a memory validated, a lie admitted. It is not about shocking the reader but about solidifying what we already suspected. The emotional weight lands with force because it's earned. An obstacle presents itself, not a twist, but a final test. The protagonist must confront something they've avoided the entire story, a person, place, truth, or part of themselves. This is the moment where their transformation is either proven or broken. Time compresses here. Scenes become tighter, transitions quicker. There's a pulse to the pacing that mirrors urgency without panic. Visual and emotional intensity builds, colors heighten, language sharpens, details accumulate. The reader is meant to feel the stakes. Secondary characters may offer support or challenge, but they no longer lead. The protagonist is at the center, and the world responds to their momentum. Sound design might swell, music returns, or silence deepens, each beat underscoring the coming culmination. The section ends at the edge of climax. Everything has led to this point, not just plot-wise, but thematically. The story pauses at the precipice of the final act, holding tension like a held breath. A symbolic image signals readiness, a door opened but not entered, a suitcase packed, a weapon laid down or picked up, a final message written but not sent. These images are not about resolution, they are about preparedness. The protagonist stands not as the person they were, but as who they've become. The audience understands that while the final step has not yet been taken, nothing will ever be the same. This is the climax, not just in plot, but in meaning. Every decision, every fragment of emotion, every layered theme now rushes forward. The story is no longer hinting or building. It is delivering. The protagonist faces the central confrontation, not always with a villain, but often with a part of themselves or the deepest truth the narrative has hidden. The setting is heightened, emotionally and visually charged. It may be familiar, but now it carries symbolic weight. A childhood home, an abandoned institution, a city street at night, whatever it is, it echoes with memory and consequence. Light and shadow interplay with narrative intention. The pace is sharp. Dialogue is minimal and loaded. Every silence, every look, every gesture lands heavily. This isn't about volume, it's about gravity. The air feels dense. The reader knows something irreversible is about to happen. The confrontation unfolds, and it is more emotional than physical. Truths are spoken. Forgiveness is sought, or denied. A secret is revealed that reframes everything, not with shock, but with clarity. The story stops being a mystery and becomes a mirror. The protagonist acts, not out of impulse, but with full awareness of what's at stake. Their choice is difficult, perhaps painful, but unmistakably theirs. This moment defines them. Stylistically, the language may break pattern, become poetic, fragmented, or even silent. A passage might play out entirely in images or in a monologue. The form serves feeling. The story bends toward expression, not explanation. Fallout. The choice is made. The confrontation ends. What was broken is not magically fixed, but it has moved. Something has shifted in the world because the protagonist has shifted within themselves. Relationships are altered, space feels different, the body breathes differently. Tone-wise, the story exhales. The chaos settles, but not neatly. The narrative makes clear, resolution is not the same as restoration. There are things that cannot be undone. But there is now truth, and that is enough. The characters sit with silence. The audience is given time to process, to grieve, to reflect. A key visual motif, perhaps used throughout the story, now returns in a final, softened form. It doesn't demand attention, it lingers, like a scent or a song. The final moments are quiet, intentional, and resonant. The story ends not on a bang, but on a note that reverberates beyond the page. The protagonist walks away, or stays behind. They speak one last line, or none at all. What matters is what remains. Themes are not restated, they are embodied. The reader understands not because the story told them what to think, but because it let them feel. A question may remain unanswered, not to frustrate, but to honor complexity. The closing image is precise, a flickering street lamp, a scarred photo, a sunrise through smoke, a sound fading into stillness. It does not say the end. It says it continues. And it does. In the reader. This section serves as a quiet coda, an aftermath. The climax has passed, but its ripples continue. The protagonist is no longer fighting, chasing, or unraveling. They are absorbing, processing, existing in the wake of transformation. The world appears altered, not because it has changed, but because they have. Familiar places are re-seen, routines resumed or rejected. There's a softness in the tone now, melancholic, maybe, but not tragic. This is about presence. Dialogue is rare and tender. Conversations now exist in the space between words. Glances, pauses, unfinished thoughts carry weight. The characters, and the story itself, are learning how to live again. The narrative reintroduces quiet symbolism. A recurring object, previously broken, lost, or feared, is now touched with care. It hasn't magically healed, but it holds different meaning now. Likewise, the protagonist's body may show signs of what they've been through, scars, posture, breathing patterns. There's a return to rhythm, natural cycles, seasons changing, day turning to night. The structure of the story mimics this calm, unfolding like slow breath. There is no urgency, but there is movement. Not forward, necessarily. Deeper. This is often the part where the protagonist reconnects with someone in a new way. Not a reconciliation, maybe, but an honest moment, a shared silence, a remembered song, a meal eaten together. A signal that life is not whole, but possible. The story gently reframes its themes. What began as a search for answers has become something else, a capacity for holding contradiction, for existing inside uncertainty without being destroyed by it. There is often a literal act of grounding, feet in soil, hands in water, breath in cold air. These elemental gestures signal embodiment, being here, now, fully. The camera, so to speak, lingers on textures, light shifts, minute details. The macro becomes micro. Internal narration may briefly return, not with confusion or urgency, but clarity. The protagonist reflects not to explain, but to acknowledge. Regret may remain. So might longing. But now they coexist with something quieter, peace. The final lines are distilled. The language becomes spare, almost haiku-like. The closing image is intimate and specific, a candle going out, a hand resting on glass, a seed being planted, an old radio humming. It's not meant to conclude the story, it's meant to let it echo. The protagonist is alone, or not. They leave, or stay. They speak, or they don't. But whatever choice is made, it's no longer about the plot. It's about presence. About being in relation to the world with open eyes. The story ends, not with finality, but with invitation. The reader is left with a sense of having witnessed not just events, but transformation. Not just what happened, but what it meant to endure it. This section functions as a reflective mirror held up to the entire narrative. It's not epilogue, not quite a where are they now recap, but rather a thematic echo chamber, drawing together threads of identity, memory, and meaning without overt resolution. The protagonist exists now in stillness, but it's an earned stillness. The kind that follows storms. Their presence feels weightier, more grounded. Actions are few but intentional, watering a plant, writing a letter, walking a known path in a new way. Each gesture reflects transformation without fanfare. The tone leans elegiac. There is gratitude laced with sorrow, a kind of reverent silence. The story is aware of its own ending and moves like someone treading lightly so as not to disturb the final moments. There's a return of images from the earliest chapters, maybe an object on a table, a recurring soundscape, or a phrase that once opened the story. But now, they're charged with new significance. They don't complete a circle, they reframe it. Narrative perspective may zoom out slightly, not omniscient, but observant. The camera, metaphorically, pans wider, allowing the protagonist to become part of something larger. This might be community, landscape, or even history. The focus shifts from self to relation. Importantly, no large events occur. The drama is gone. What remains is the residue of experience, a kind of psychological and emotional sediment that has settled. The reader feels this weight, not heavy, but real. Time begins to loosen again, but not in confusion, more like poetry. Sentences stretch. Descriptions bloom. The world feels rich again, full of small details that the protagonist now notices with tenderness. Nature may become a more active presence, wind brushing through trees, light dancing on a wall, insects buzzing in golden dusk. These moments are not symbolic in the old sense, they are direct experiences, deeply lived. They don't mean something. They are something. The protagonist now moves with full agency, but that agency is quiet. Choosing to stay, to rest, to speak gently, to listen deeply, these are acts of power now. The story subtly suggests that wisdom has little to do with control and everything to do with acceptance. And finally, the closing image. It does not seek to impress. It's not metaphor-heavy or dramatic. It's specific. A hand brushing fabric. A door creaking open. A voice humming low. A single breath. The story ends not with what happens next, but with what it means to have lived this far. The reader is left not with clarity, but with depth. The final sentence lands like a heartbeat, not loud, not final, but rhythmic. Alive. There is no definitive closure. Just presence. Just continuation, off the page, into the world. This section serves as a soft re-entry, not into the plot, which has already fulfilled its arc, but into continuity. Life after narrative. The protagonist is still here, still breathing, still choosing. The story lingers to honor that. Tone-wise, it is observational. The world continues moving, neighbors hang laundry, trains pass in the distance, seasons inch forward. These mundane rhythms, once background noise, now carry emotional resonance. They feel like reminders that healing isn't loud, it's lived. The protagonist is not better. They're different. Subtle changes show in posture, in speech, in how they interact with space. If they once avoided mirrors, they now glance without flinching. If they once rushed, they now pause. The trauma isn't erased, but it no longer defines them. The narrative revisits relationships, some frayed, others quietly mended. These moments aren't about reconciliation in a grand sense, but about presence and mutual recognition. An apology might not be spoken, but it lives in a shared cup of tea, or a gesture of care. Community, however small, begins to reform. A friend returns, a stranger offers help, a routine resumes. These aren't plot developments, they're emotional scaffolding. Evidence that the protagonist is no longer isolated, even if solitude remains part of their nature. Time becomes measurable again. Dates, hours, seasons, these concepts have shape now. This marks a return to embodied life, to awareness of cycles and structure. The story gently allows the reader to believe in a future. Here, there's often a symbolic reconstruction, a room cleaned out, a garden tended, a wall painted over. These acts are more than healing metaphors, they're choices to engage with the world. The protagonist becomes an author of their own space, however humble. The story allows breath. Paragraphs stretch. Language takes its time. There is no rush to finish, only a desire to fully inhabit these moments before farewell. Beauty lies in detail, the creak of a chair, the flicker of candlelight, the crack of old floorboards. There may be one last internal monologue, this time not filled with questions, but observations. Not "why did this happen to me," but "this is how it feels to be here now." The shift is subtle, profound. The section ends with a closing of some kind, a literal door, a journal entry, a final look at the horizon. Not as punctuation, but as a gentle fade. It honors the past without returning to it. The protagonist no longer needs to chase meaning. Their being is the meaning now. Their breath, their body, their daily life. This is where the story has always been heading, not to answers, but to existence. The final image is delicate but strong. A match struck in darkness. A hand releasing a stone. Eyes closed, then opened. It does not scream ending, it whispers continuing. This section is quiet, spacious, and intentional. It's the narrative's final landing, not a conclusion, but a settling. The protagonist has stopped seeking. They are now simply being. And in that being, there is immense power. The setting reflects this, not symbolic, not dramatic, just lived in. A kitchen with warm light. A bench under a tree. A small apartment filled with the sound of life. The story is now about presence, not resolution. Language becomes soft and deliberate. Short sentences. Simple imagery. The emotional palette is warm, but with a faint ache, like remembering something beautiful that you can never fully hold again. A kind of nostalgic piece. We may see the protagonist doing something seemingly minor, repairing something broken, preparing a meal, watching the sky change. But these small acts are imbued with the full weight of everything that came before. There is no longer a need for flashbacks or monologue. The past is integrated. Instead, the narrative leans into sensory richness, the feel of fabric, the sound of wind, the taste of tea. The world is re-inhabited through the body, not the mind. Relationships now carry quiet grace. A hand is held without explanation. A door is left open without fear. Dialogue is less important than shared silence. Trust, once broken or tentative, becomes a background hum. Symbolic elements return one final time, often changed. The object that once represented loss now represents endurance. The place once avoided becomes a place of return. Repetition, used sparingly, now offers comfort rather than dread. The story allows the protagonist to rest. Not to end, not to succeed, but to pause. To sit in a world no longer shaped by avoidance. This is not a victory arc. It's a survival arc. A breathing arc. Tone-wise, the narrative tilts toward light, filtered, imperfect, but unmistakably present. There's no illusion that everything is fixed. But the reader understands, this moment is whole, and that is enough. The final moment is crafted with care. Not grand, not loud, just true. It may be a gesture, eyes closing, a page being turned, a lamp being switched off. Or a phrase, simple, final, but open-ended. Something like, and then, the day went on. The story ends not by tying a knot, but by leaving a thread in the reader's hand. It trusts the reader to carry it forward. To remember not the plot, but the feeling of what was lived. And so it closes, not with punctuation, but with breath. Still, warm, and alive. This final section is a departure, not from the narrative, but from the need to narrate. The story no longer explains, reveals, or resolves. It lets go. It releases the reader gently into their own thoughts, their own memories, their own silence. The protagonist no longer needs to be observed. They are not performing healing or transformation. They are simply living, and the camera, the narrator, the structure itself knows it's time to step back. The world is intact in its imperfection. The protagonist walks through it with unhurried awareness. There is no dramatic reveal, no final twist. Only continuity. Only presence. Language thins intentionally. Sentences may become short, declarative, or they may stretch like long exhalations. The rhythm now mirrors the natural breath of someone who has stopped running, not because they gave up, but because they arrived. The setting is illuminated with gentle finality. We may see a sunset, not as a metaphor, but as what it is. Or hear a final song, something the protagonist used to hate, now listen to with quiet affection. This is emotional completion, not narrative closure. The protagonist is alone, or with someone, it doesn't matter. What matters is their peace with it. There is no longer a tension between being seen and unseen. They exist without needing witness or justification. There may be one last symbolic gesture, something understated but resonant, planting a seed, mailing a letter, turning away from a mirror. The reader understands this is not a signal of what's next, but a whisper, "I am here, and that is enough." Themes that have hummed throughout the work, memory, grief, identity, resilience, now hum more softly, like echoes heard from another room. They're not solved. They're held. That is the story's quiet revolution. And if there's a return to something from the very beginning, a phrase, an object, a place, it now holds the full emotional charge of the entire journey. Not as repetition, but as transformation. The final line is deliberate. Not the end. Not even "and they lived happily ever after." Instead, it's something that breathes, open, uncertain, soft. Maybe a single word. Maybe a fragment. Maybe nothing at all. The story doesn't end, it steps aside. It invites the reader to sit with what remains. To revisit, reread, remember, not because they have to, but because it mattered. And in that space between the last line and the closing of the book, something lingers. Not closure. Not solution. Just this. Continuing. This section exists in the after, a space stories rarely dwell in. The transformation is complete, the dust has long settled, and yet life persists. This is where legacy begins, not as grand impact, but as quiet imprint. The protagonist is no longer the central force. They blend into the world, not as a loss of identity, but as an embrace of interconnection. They are part of rather than apart from. Their presence is no longer narrative, it's elemental. Tone-wise, there's something contemplative, even meditative. The world is described in slow, close detail, the shape of light on a floor, the sound of boiling water, the weight of air before rain. The protagonist is listening, not speaking. New rhythms emerge, not as resolutions, but as natural evolutions. A garden grows. A neighbor's child waves. A door is knocked on, not with urgency, but invitation. These are not story beats, they're pulses of life. And that is enough. The protagonist may take on a new role, not as a hero, but as a witness, a keeper, a quiet guide. They might offer advice, or simply presence. They become the kind of figure they once sought, not answers, but a place to rest within. There is a tenderness in how they now approach memory, not to dissect or explain, but to hold. The past doesn't grip them anymore. It lives beside them, like a companion that no longer needs to speak. Structure-wise, the story begins to dissolve. Paragraphs may space out more. Time skips. Sentences float. It's not disorientation, it's dissolution into peace. The narrative spine loosens, allowing the reader to drift slightly, dreamlike, without fear of being lost. One might sense that the story is beginning to release itself, like a breath finally let go, or a tide pulling gently back. There's no tension left to hold it upright. And that's intentional. It wants to become atmosphere, not architecture. We witness one final act, not decisive, not dramatic, but deeply true. Maybe the protagonist writes something down. Maybe they simply sit in silence. The point is not what they do, but how quietly they exist while doing it. The final page doesn't close the story, it dissolves it. We're left with the hum of life continuing, not because a narrative requires it, but because time moves forward. The world is still here. The protagonist is still here. And we are, too. There is no final word. The section doesn't want to end. It wants to linger, like steam, like song, like memory. It wants to remain in the room after the reader has gone. And maybe that's the point now, not how it ends, but how long it stays with you. The story has now passed the boundary of its own architecture. This section exists in a post-narrative state, where storytelling becomes observation, where memory becomes texture, and where the protagonist's presence becomes almost ambient. There is very little movement now. Instead, there is attention. The sound of footsteps on wooden floors. The way light shifts across a wall over hours. The taste of tea after silence. These moments are not symbolic. They are existence as meaning. The protagonist doesn't perform awareness, they embody it. Their stillness is not stagnation, it's attention honed into presence. They are not thinking about the past. They are carrying it, effortlessly, like a shadow in late afternoon. A new motif might emerge, not to start a new arc, but to suggest that life has layers even outside the scope of this narrative. Maybe it's a new name spoken. A bird seen every morning. A letter unopened on a windowsill. Not as seeds of plot, but as soft invitations. This, too, matters. The narrative voice may become more distant now, or more intimate, depending on the tone. It might read like someone remembering someone else's life. Or like someone sitting beside you in quiet companionship, not to explain, but to be with. This section begins to erase the boundary between character and reader. You begin to feel not just for the protagonist, but as if you are them, or beside them, sharing breath, stillness, space. Here, the writing itself begins to fade in clarity, not in meaning, but in edge. Sentences might drift, fragment, breathe. Thoughts may trail off. The mind wanders, but not anxiously. It's the wonder of someone watching clouds change shape, knowing they don't need to name them. The world is tender here. Nothing threatens. Nothing interrupts. The story doesn't need conflict anymore, it has become a vessel for reflection. This portion may include one last sensory detail that feels final without being conclusive. A window opened after rain. A garment folded with care. A familiar smell rediscovered after years. It stays with you, not for what it means, but for how true it feels. The section closes like a candle burning low, not extinguished, but reaching its natural end. You feel the weight of it, the quiet warmth, the echo in the room where the story once lived. No epilogue is needed. No pronouncement. Just this, the protagonist breathes. The world breathes. The page breathes. And then, nothing. And that nothing is sacred. This section begins beyond silence. The story, in a way, is already over, but like light after the sun has set, it continues to reach us. This is after presence, not absence, not closure, but a subtle shimmer of meaning that refuses to fully fade. There's no protagonist in the center now. There is no center at all. The focus dissolves into environment, memory, breath. We are in the place where the narrative has let go, and what remains is trace. Like smoke. Like scent. The writing is spare. Each word is chosen like someone folding a letter they'll never send. Space speaks louder than text. And the reader listens differently now, not with curiosity, but with a kind of reverent stillness. We may return, briefly, to an earlier image. A tree. A hallway. A song. But it's not framed as remember this. It's quieter than that. The past rises like dust in sunbeams, not to be understood, just to be witnessed. There's a generosity here, not in information but in permission to feel without needing to know. To sit with the unsolved. To carry the weight without having to drop it. A new kind of time takes over, not linear, not circular, but felt. Like waiting for bread to rise. Like knowing rain is coming. The reader is no longer reading forward. They're just dwelling. Formally, the story may now look like something else, a short poem, a list, a single image extended across lines. Or nothing written at all for several lines, just breathing room. The prose honors the idea that not everything must be filled. We feel the edges blur, not because of confusion, but because of surrender. The reader is no longer outside the narrative. They are inside the hush it left behind. This section is not about what's next. It's about what remains. Not the resolution of conflict, but the resonance of having endured. And then something shifts. A bird cries in the distance. A curtain stirs. A line appears on the page like a whisper you didn't expect. And somewhere, something begins. It's not a new story. It's not a promise. It's a pulse. A barely there signal that though this narrative has ended, life hasn't. And never will. The story doesn't close. It recedes. Like tide. Like memory. Like love. This section is barely a section at all. It feels like the space after the music stops, but before anyone moves. A breath held at the end of a prayer. A still frame, flickering, refusing to fade to black. We're no longer watching the protagonist. We're not watching anyone. We're simply here. Inside what remains. Inside what never needed words to begin with. Language becomes translucent. Sentences arrive like ripples. Thoughts appear as shadows, outlines, half-shaped meanings. There's no more story to tell, only presence to sit inside. There may be a return to something so small, so fleeting, it almost escapes attention, the way the wind moved in section 1, a name barely spoken, a gesture once dismissed. But now, it lands like truth. The narrative doesn't call attention to itself. It almost apologizes for still being here. But that's its gift, it remains, just long enough to let you know you're not alone in the silence. This is the last room in the house. There's nothing inside it but light, dust, and space to breathe. And that, the story tells you without speaking, is enough. A question may emerge, not from the character, not from the writer, but from the space between them. A question with no answer. One that isn't meant to be solved, only held. What now? There is no reply. Only a page that doesn't turn. Only a moment that doesn't end. Only the reader, sitting in the soft echo of all that was. The final line may not even be a line. It might be a space. Or a breath. Or this. And in that emptiness, everything lingers. Not to haunt, but to belong. The story has ended. But the reader is still alive. And that is the true continuation. This is where the story lets go. Not because it has nothing left to say, but because it trusts that you carry it now. No more characters, no more turning points. Just breath. Just presence. The quiet echo of everything that's been lived. Now settling into memory. The final gift of the story is not closure, but continuation. Not on the page, but in you. So go. Not away from the story, but with it. Still, silent, alive.